Here in Working Phase Part 1, we're going to be talking about treatment plans. After we've conducted our intake interview, we need to come up with a plan for how we're going to treat the individual based on what they've told us and what we know about their case. We're going to do that by looking at several different aspects, but starting with treatment planning and specifically talking about goals and objectives. So we're going to jump right into it, and we're going to talk about the 5 basic areas of the working phase, and we're going to talk about them in 4 separate lectures, so we won't cover all of it today or in this lecture. So the working phase is comprised of treatment plans, interventions, notes, high-risk clients, and termination. Those are the 5 aspects we're going to cover. We're going to focus on treatment plans today, which specifically we're going to talk about goals and objectives. Interventions are part of treatment plans, but we're going to talk about them separately because they're so powerful. There's a couple of reasons they're powerful. First, it's what you're going to be skilled at doing in order to intervene in the problem. The other is that insurance companies rely on interventions as a way to reimburse. Unless you're doing a totally cash pay system, interventions are going to be the way that you make your money. So when we talk about treatment planning, we're talking about some elements of a document. So a treatment plan, or a plan of care sometimes it's called, you will have several aspects that you must include. One of them is the presenting problem. The good news is that you've already got the presenting problem from the intake assessment. So when the person talks about what their problem is, you can reiterate that on the treatment plan. What it does is it creates a standalone document. So if you looked only at the treatment plan, you would get a thumbnail sketch of the individual's issue by looking at the presenting problem. Now, it's not comprehensive because the intake assessment, is many pages long, but we're looking at just an overview. So you have a presenting problem. It's also sensible to include some other background information on the treatment plan as well, just as a reminder of the type of person that you're seeing. So it would be reasonable to include something like race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, whatever you need to include to give an overview of who the individual is. You don't need to reiterate everything from your assessment, but you do want to give the impression that this individual has some characteristics that contribute to the treatment plan of care. So you have the presenting problem, then you have goals and objectives. So the goals are the overall aspects of treatment that you want to work toward. So goals are usually pretty general. So it's the general outcome. So let's say that somebody comes in with something that's pretty run-of-the-mill in terms of issues that you might see, and they're having a problem adjusting to a certain situation. Let's say that they're having a hard time adjusting to college. So a goal might be the client will feel good about being in college. That's a very simple goal. It's really broad and general, but that's the goal. Or the person will feel comfortable making friends at college. That could be another goal. It's pretty vague and general, but that's the idea of a goal. You're working toward this overall sense that you can feel better in this particular example. Now, the objectives are the stepping stones. If you have a goal like the client will feel better about being in college, the objectives are the ways that you're going to approach that goal. For example, the person will get used to their class schedule and be able to negotiate when to go to lunch and everything else, and they will do that by a certain date. So that objective is a small stepping stone to feeling comfortable at college. Maybe another objective is something like the client will become a part of one organization that helps them to feel like they're a part of college. So the objectives are specific and they're stepping stones that will help them meet their goals. We work with the client to develop the goals and the objectives. So we're also going to include modalities and interventions. Those are the things that we do as practitioners to help the person. So the person is going to do the objectives. We're going to help them by providing interventions. We're going to teach them some things. We might do some coaching. We might do some motivation interviewing. We might, if it's a deep enough issue, we might do some kind of psychodynamic intervention. Whatever it is, that's what we do. So the clients do the goals and objectives. We do the modalities and the interventions. We also reiterate the clinical impression or the diagnosis depending on what kind of practitioner you are. As students, you'll be doing clinical impressions or that diagnostic statement. What, those are kind of synonymous. Just what is going on. That way, it's a reminder of some of the issues that we are trying to address. And then you include your name and credentials. So your name and credentials will be whatever your name is, and we'll go ahead and extrapolate for this degree. So you can say your name, comma, BA, because your credential will be a Bachelor of Arts. Now, something you have to keep in mind is that the treatment plans are person-centered, meaning that it's all about the client. That's a law in the state of Michigan that treatment plans have to be person-centered. You cannot create a treatment plan without the individual present at the session, either in person or over the phone or whatever. The person must be a part of developing the treatment plan. So let's start with the first element, that's the presenting problem. The presenting problem, again, is that problem statement that is direct and specific. When we talk about a presenting problem, we're talking about what the client says they are experiencing that is contributing to whatever hardship they're experiencing. We use the client statements. I love to start my presenting problems with a quotation. It is something that the person said directly from their mouths. I am having trouble feeling comfortable in public. Okay, good. That's a problem statement. I'm having trouble feeling comfortable in public. There are lots of reasons why that might be the case, but that doesn't matter at this moment. The presenting problem is only what they're saying. Now, another example could be something like, I am not sure where to go for help obtaining services. That is, obviously that's kind of like my words when I'm creating that example, but somebody would probably say something like, I don't know where to go for help, period. But I'm not sure where to go for help obtaining services could be a presenting problem. That's something that we can work on. Those are the client statements. We do not speculate what the problem is. All we're taking is their presenting problem. We can elaborate on it later on, but when we're doing the quotation that they are talking about, we just write what they write. So for the first example, I'm having trouble feeling comfortable in public. We do not say, the client reports feeling uncomfortable around people. We don't know that. All we know is that they're having trouble feeling comfortable in public. It could be people, it could be the space, it could be the weather. Maybe they don't like being out where it's hot or too cold or whatever. We don't know why, so we don't speculate. We don't say the client reports feeling comfortable around people unless they say I don't feel comfortable around people. Then we can elaborate and say that's what they said, but we don't know until they tell us. For the second example, I'm not sure where to go for help obtaining services. We don't speculate. We don't say something like the client has not tried to obtain his or her own services. We don't know if they've tried or not. All they've said is that they're not sure where to go for help. Maybe they haven't tried, but maybe they have. We don't know. All we know is what they tell us. So the presenting problem needs to be from the client's perspective. We can elaborate on it after we ask them questions. So a presenting problem could be a couple sentences long, to where the client says, I'm having trouble feeling comfortable in public. And we say, can you tell me what about being in public makes you feel uncomfortable? And they say something like, yeah, being around people makes me feel uncomfortable. Okay, now we can say, the client's presenting problem is that they are having trouble feeling comfortable in public and that they are uncomfortable around people. Then we can tie that together, but not until we've explored it and the person has said that from their own mouths. So try not to speculate the presenting problems. The presenting problem is kind of what we want to address and kind of where we start working through the goals, which takes us to goals. So goals are outcomes. If you have a presenting problem, that's kind of the statement from the individual. The goal is what you are going to address as a way to alleviate the presenting problem. So the goal is the outcome from the services that we're going to provide. So if we're going to be using some kind of stress management therapy, like mindfulness, for example, or assertive and commitment therapy, ACT, we can have goals that are around those, but the goals need to address the problem statement. So let's take, for example, somebody who's feeling uncomfortable in public places. One of the goals could be the client will feel comfortable going to the grocery store once a week. That's a perfectly fine goal to have, as long as that's what the individual is wanting to address, but that's a perfectly fine goal to have. the goal needs to be appropriate for the situation. And that goal is appropriate for the situation. If the person says, I'm having a hard time being around people, especially at the grocery store, and we make a goal that says the person would feel comfortable at the grocery store once a week, then that's a perfectly good goal. Ideally, when you have a set of goals, and by the way, you can have more than one goal, when you have a set of goals and you've achieved those goals, therapy is over. Now, that really relies on one major aspect, in that the goals are set up to address all of the concerns that the individual has. Now, they might not leave therapy pristine and squeaky clean, but if we can address the goals that they've established, then we can usually have them stop a therapeutic episode, meaning they'll be done with therapy in that moment, and go and kind of live life, and then they can come back if they continue to have issues or if something else comes up. So the idea is to create goals that will allow them to get to a point in their lives where they feel more comfortable without therapy. Generally, the goals are abstract, so something like, I would like to feel less depressed. That's a perfectly fine goal. You can imagine that there are lots of different ways that you would address that goal, but it's a goal nonetheless. We have some goals in the additional resources folder and the treatment planning folder, so please feel free to look through those. It's just an example. I mean, there are books dedicated to developing goals. You can also create goals creatively if you want to. I typically do that. You kind of do this for a while. You see lots of goals, and you can have a basic idea of what the goal might be, but you tailor it to the individual, so we tend to create them more often than not. So if we have a goal, which is the general thing that we're going to work toward, the general solution that we're going to work toward, the way that we get there is through objectives. So objectives are the stepping stones for goal attainment. So like goals, objectives are outcomes. They are the things that we are going to work toward. But unlike goals, objectives are very specific. We're going to talk about a particular model that we use to develop goals called the SMART objective model. So the completion of the objectives will lead to the completion of the goals. And as we said, once you complete your goal, you complete therapy. So really what we're doing is we're developing a treatment plan that allows us to work toward eventual goal attainment as long as we use our treatment plan effectively to do it. Objectives are said to be SMART. So a SMART objective is one that is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Sometimes called time-bound or timing. There's some variations in there, but they all kind of mean the same thing. You will hear the term SMART goals a lot, and in some senses that might be accurate, but in mental health settings, the goals are more vague and the objectives are SMART. So we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But let me give you an example of what an objective might be. If somebody comes in with a presenting problem that they don't feel comfortable in public, and maybe it's because they don't like being around people, we can have the goal that says that the individual will feel comfortable going to the grocery store once a week. That's a goal. It's relatively vague. It doesn't really tell us any stepping stones of how we're going to achieve that. But the goal might be something like, by the third week, the individual will go to the store one time with the maximum uncomfortable score. You can just have them rate there how uncomfortable they are on a scale of 1 to 10, with a maximum uncomfortable score of a 7 out of 10, indicating that they are able to go to the store with some anxiety or some uncomfortableness, but not completely resolved. So you would have kind of this wordy, specific, relevant, time-bound type objective. And if they're able to do that, then they're moving toward the goal. So you can have a stepping stone of objectives. You can say by week 3, they'll go to the store once and have a maximum score of 7 out of 10. And then you can have another objective that says that by week 5, they'll be able to go to the store and just one time, sometime in that 5-week period, and have a maximum uncomfortable score of 5. And you can have stepping stone objectives. So you could have maybe a series of 2 or 3 objectives that speak to reducing uncomfortableness as they go to the store in a certain amount of weeks. And maybe the last one will be the overall goal, which is to go to the store and feel comfortable about doing it once a week. So maybe by the end of that goal, the objective is something like, for 3 weeks in a row, the individual will go to the store one time each week and have a maximum uncomfortable score of 3 out of 10. And if they obtain that, then they will have obtained the goal, and then they'll be done with that goal. And if that's the only goal they have, then they'll be done with therapy. So eventually, you're going to create these objectives in order to obtain the goals. And if you do them systematically, you can kind of work up through your objectives, and you will have attained the goal at the end of it. So when we talk about SMART goals, excuse me, there I said it. When we talk about SMART objectives, all of our objectives need to be written in such a way that they are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. When you work in a mental health setting and you have SMART objectives, you will sometimes have them audited by people. Maybe it's a peer review. Maybe there is like a local administration that keeps track of these things before they go out to the insurance companies, whatever they are. But they'll go through and they'll say, hey, this objective isn't SMART. It's not attainable. The person can't do it within the realm of treatment or whatever. So we need to make sure that they meet all these criteria. So in order for a goal, there I go again, an objective to be SMART, it needs to be specific. What exactly will the client be doing to develop skills? Okay, we don't want to have a lot of compound objectives. We want to do one thing at a time. For example, instead of me saying something like, the objective is that the individual will go to the store once in the first 3 weeks, twice in the second, or twice in 5 weeks, or 3 times in 9 weeks, ... Okay, that's too much. We need to break that down into separate objectives. So we want them to be specific, but we can't make them too compound because then it's hard to keep track of it. So a perfectly specific objective for the case that we've been talking about for the last few minutes is, in terms of just being specific, the individual will go to their local grocery store one time and go grocery shopping with their usual list. That's a perfectly specific objective. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to list what they're going to get, how much time they're going to spend there necessarily, unless timing is some kind of concern that they have. But generally, it's just go to the store where you normally go with your grocery list and go grocery shopping. You walk in, you get a cart, you grocery shop, you check out, and you leave. That kind of thing. But it also needs to be measurable. Generally, we're going to use numbers to quantify. So you notice that I've been talking about how comfortable are you when you're at the store and how often are you going. It needs to be numeric. That way we can track progress numerically. There are perfectly reasonable quantitative ways to measure how people are feeling. So if I said, how are you feeling? And they said, well, I feel kind of antsy about going. Okay, that's a perfectly fine way to develop an understanding of the progress that they're making. Maybe they've gone from antsy to just uncomfortable, or maybe from antsy to just a little bit stressed or a little worried. Whatever it is, we can still measure that, but in terms of developing SMART objectives that we can use in clinical settings, we need to be thinking about measuring it numerically. Now, I am a psychodynamic counselor, so what that means for me is that I'm repulsed by the idea of putting numbers on everything. But I recognize that it's important to be able to measure progress, especially when we're talking about managed care, like working with insurances or working in community mental health settings to where they need to be able to track these outcomes. I get it, and I go along with it, even though it's not my preferred way of measuring progress. In private practice, I don't use a lot of those numeric scales, but for the sake of teaching you how to do this and doing it properly and 90% of the things you're going to work in, it's very reasonable to talk about measurement. So we use measurements whenever we can, measuring things in frequencies, so doing something a certain amount of times. For example, if we're working with somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder, maybe we'll say something like, we will limit the number of compulsive behaviors that you have to 3 per day after 6 weeks. So it's measurable. They can say, yeah, you know what, I did hand washing and I did doorknob twisting, and that's it. Okay, good. That means that they did fewer than 3. That means they've attained that objective. So we can measure the frequency of something or the intensity on a scale of 1 to 10. How awful was it to go out into public or to drive your car or something like that? We can also measure something like time. So how much time do you spend doing something? So if, again, kind of maybe an obsessive compulsive person might spend 10 minutes washing their hands at a time, we can reduce that. Maybe after 3 weeks, the individual will reduce their hand washing time from 10 minutes to 8 minutes per hand washing session. So whatever you try to do, try to make it measurable so that you know when you're done with something. To say something like the individual will feel more comfortable going to the grocery store. Okay, how much is more comfortable? How do you know when that person has reached a satisfactory comfort level? So we need to make sure that it's measurable. Attainable. Can they attain the objective? Is it realistic to do within time and treatment? So can the individual do what they're doing in the treatment realm? So, for example, if we go back to the example with grocery shopping or going into public and trying to feel comfortable grocery shopping, if we said something like, within 3 weeks, the individual will have no discomfort going to the grocery store, that's probably not realistic. It's not attainable because there needs to be some smaller stepping stones in there. Most of the time, people are pretty good about making their goals attainable. There are some situations where somebody might make a goal that's completely unattainable, and that can be. Let me say it this way: there are only certain situations where making a goal unattainable is done accidentally. We're pretty much able to recognize when something is unattainable or unrealistic to do. Let me use an example of somebody who is an alcoholic. So if I said something like, this person comes, okay, so let's say the presenting problem is that the person has been drinking so much that it's really stressing their family relationships. And the goal is to be alcohol free at the end of therapy. If I said an objective to be something like, the individual will stop drinking alcohol cold turkey and attend AA sessions every week and have 0 relapses. If that were an objective, it would not be realistic. It would not be something, even though it's specific and measurable and everything, it's not realistic that they would have 0 relapses or to expect them to have 0 relapses, and even to quit cold turkey. That all can be very difficult to do. So it's not very realistic. So we want to build the objectives toward that. So it might be something like the first objective would be the individual will attend 1 AA meeting per week. And then, after 3 weeks or by 3 weeks, they would attend 1 AA meeting a week. And then you might have another objective that says something like the individual will go for 4 weeks without having any alcohol. And then another objective might be by 8 weeks, the individual will be attending AA meetings 3 days a week, plus engaging in intensive outpatient therapy and be sober for 6 weeks. You want to build up to that. So you want to make sure that the objectives are reasonable within therapy. Relevant. Does the objective relate to therapy? If the person we'll use the same example. If the person comes in and says that I'm having a really hard time with my relationships in the home with my family because of my alcohol use, and you make an objective that says something like the individual will go to work 5 days a week without using alcohol in the morning. Okay, that might be a very reasonable objective, but it's not related to their concerns. They didn't say that they were concerned about about working, and maybe they're, obviously this is probably not a good thing, but maybe they're going to work and performing their job duties as they're expected to, even though they'd had alcohol that morning. If they're not concerned about that, if it's not relevant to their issues, then you don't address it. Even though you think it's reasonable to talk about them working and going to work sober, that's not what their concerns were. Now, through motivational interviewing and talking to them and basic therapy, they might be convinced that it's a good idea to not drink alcohol before they go to work. But in that moment, until they talk about it, it's not going to be relevant to their treatment, even though it might be related to the idea of becoming sober. So you have to watch out that all of your objectives are relevant to the case, not just relevant in general as far as you're concerned as a therapist. Then last is time limited. This is the big one. You need to have a time limit. That's why I usually start a goal with by so many months, days, weeks, whatever it is, they will complete this thing. And within reason, you need to have good time limits. So if you think that somebody is going to remain sober for 3 weeks Let me say it this way. In 8 weeks, the individual will have attained 3 weeks of sobriety. Okay, so somewhere in that 8-week time period, they need to obtain 3 straight weeks of sobriety. That's perfectly fine. But if he said something like the individual will be sober for 3 weeks in 1 month, so that means that they have 1 month to have 3 weeks of sobriety, that can be very difficult because really what that means is they have to be sober at the very latest on day 8 of therapy, which can be very difficult, maybe even impossible. So the time limit needs to be sensible, but it does need to be there. It needs to be specific to the individual, and it needs to be reasonable. We're going to be doing a SMART objective activity, so be prepared for that. Let's scoot down to the interventions. We're going to have an entire session dedicated to talking about interventions, but I do want to talk about them here just briefly. So the interventions are the things that we do as clinicians in order to facilitate the individual obtaining their objectives and eventually their goal. It's what we're trained to do. It's using cognitive behavioral therapy interventions, maybe Gestalt techniques, mindfulness. If we're working with couples, maybe it's something like a Gottman method. There's lots of different ways we can do that, but whatever it is the specific ways that we as practitioners are going to help the individual obtain the objectives and the goals. So you cannot say that the individual is going to do the intervention. So don't think that it's going to be something that the individual does. It's something that the clinicians do. One of the number one issues I see on these treatment plans is that they will say something like, for an intervention, the client is going to ... Immediately that's wrong because the clients don't do the interventions, we do the interventions. It's a skilled approach that we do as trained clinicians. So we're going to come back to that next lecture because it needs its own lecture because interventions are huge. So let's move on to the clinical impression and diagnoses. We're going to cover diagnosis more in Module 2, and you're really not going to diagnose anything in this class. I mean, you'll probably have a good idea what's going on, but we're not going to go through formal diagnostics. That's something that you'll cover if you've taken abnormal psychology. The clinical impression or the diagnostic statement is going to be what you think you are going to, let me rephrase that. The diagnostic statement or the clinical impression is what you think is going on based on the story of the intake interview that you've had. And you want to include that. So it's kind of a reiteration of what you've already done for the intake assessment. When we talk about diagnosis, we will talk about differential diagnosis, meaning what is the diagnosis that we have and how is it different from similar diagnoses? That's an important aspect. It's not enough to diagnose somebody. You really need to be thinking about why it's not something else as well. That helps to round out the diagnosis. And we use DSM-5 for that, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, version 5, and we use that in order to classify mental health disorders. And when I say we, I mean counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, or other qualified individuals who can do diagnostics. So for the treatment plan, you will include that, but really what it's going to be is going to be brought forward from the intake assessment when you've already done the clinical impression. And then the last element of the treatment plan is the name and credentials. When you sign a treatment plan, you're going to sign it yourself if you are a fully licensed practitioner. Generally, when you're right out of school, you will not be fully licensed. You will be limited license, which means that you can still practice and everything, but you have to have a supervisor sign off on your work. And that is usually the case for at least 2 years until you've attained so many hours through your licensing credentialer. So, you're going to co-sign yours with a licensed person, and even sometimes what you're going to do is you're going to create the treatment plan, someone else can take all the credit for it. That's kind of sometimes the deal. So just be ready for any of those situations, but don't feel bad because eventually you'll be the person who is taking credit for all the good work. I mean, it will be good work and you will take credit for it, but you'll be overseeing it and making sure that it all makes sense too. So that's the treatment plan. So we covered quite a lot in this lecture. We're going to have a couple of exercises that we do in class that are related to SMART objectives, and we'll have some conversation as we need to. Next class, we're going to talk about interventions, and then we'll be moving on from there. So I look forward to seeing what you can do with all this wonderful information.